Welcome, everyone. My name is Manel Camps. I serve as faculty director for the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurial Development. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second talk in the series, My Journey, featuring Dan Adams. This talk is going to be hosted by Raj Kapany. Raj is a very successful entrepreneur and technology specialist in the area of fiber optics. He's also a great friend of UCSC. He serves as trustee. He also supports the Sikh Foundation, the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurial Development, that was actually founded by his father, and that's still going strong. And he's a great supporter of entrepreneurship. And he noticed that in most programs, there's a focus on the mechanics of how to build a company, right? So how you come up with a good idea. How do you then scale the company? How do you look for clients? But there's a component that's missing and that's very important, which is the personal aspect. Entrepreneurship is very intuitive. So hearing about how other entrepreneurs went about their journeys is critically important. And this series is filling this need. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? How many of the students here need a job after they graduate? Raise your hands. So I'm here to tell you that Neuralink is a fantastic place to work. And please consider that. This is not an ad. The specialties, the scientific background, the engineering, it's all very entrepreneurial. And I believe Dan will talk a little bit more about this later in his talk. But I wanted to give you guys, first of all, an understanding of who you're meeting today. A person that's done a lot, Dr. Daniel Adams, a person that has been in the academia field for some time and has now transitioned over to a professional startup and working at creating beautiful technologies. Let me give you some background to Daniel Adams. Got his Bachelor of Science, Neuroscience, University College of London. Got his PhD in Visual Neuroscience, University College of London. In Japan, postdoc scholar, Nihon University, School of Medicine, Visual Neuroscience. Sorry if this is going a while, but this is who you're talking to today. UCSF postdoc fellow, Visual Neuroscience. Professor, UCSF, ophthalmology. University Trento, Italy, professor, Center of Mind and Brain Science. Well, you've done a lot. And Neuralink, principal investigator, scientific officer of the company. And I'm going to go on a little bit further. He has memberships in Society of Neuroscience, Cognitive Neuroscience, American Association of Science Advancement. He's done corporate talks and participated with Wellcome, Dolby, Apple, Meta, Stanford University. He's been a master's thesis supervisor for more than 15 students, and he's reviewed publications, books, and chapters, I think almost close to 50. So welcome, Dr. Daniel Adams, please, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Raj, for that very, very generous introduction.
Okay. So, Dan, from my we're all interested, is from your youth, which could be high school, college, how did you know neuroscience was going to be your career?
Well, I didn't for quite a long time. So I grew up in a tiny village in the Cambridgeshire countryside in England. And my father was a mechanical engineer and my mother was a biologist. So she's actually a biology teacher, a high school teacher of biology. And so I had an engineering side from my father and biology from my mother. And I grew up a little bit more interested in biology than mechanical engineering. And so I originally wanted to study biochemistry. But things didn't go quite as planned during some exams in the UK called the A-levels. And I had to end up taking a year off and retake my chemistry A-level because I got an E, and that wasn't enough to get to university. And during that year, I started work at a psychiatric hospital. There was a local hospital to where I grew up. And this is a hospital it was a private hospital, but it was paid for, the patients were paid for by the NHS. So these were people who the NHS couldn't handle because they were too violent, too disturbed, or too disruptive. And at the tender age of 18, I was thrown in among adults with schizophrenia, psychosis, and paranoia and delusions, basically to live with them during the day, but also to, when they got unmanageable, to physically, literally hold them down. And this was, I think, one of the really decisive parts of my interest. I mean, what I came to realize just talking to people, to psychiatric patients, severely mentally ill people every day, was just how important brain health is, how much of our everyday world obviously is in our heads, and how when something simple, presumably simple or maybe quite complex, goes wrong in the brain, it can change a person's personality, their outlook on life, the way they're accepted in society, and absolutely everything about that person can change. And so that really brought it home to me just how important this sort of piece of meat that we have inside our skull is, and inspired me to not study biochemistry, but to study neuroscience. And really by good fortune at that time, there was a sort of boon. This is 1990. And there was a boon in studying neuroscience at that time. And at University College London, I was actually one of the first people, or in the first year, that neuroscience was offered as a degree individually. So there were 7 of us in that very first year of neuroscience at UCL. And I was one of those 7 people. So, and I was never disappointed by studying neuroscience. Every field, I never went on to study mental illness, but every part of neuroscience for me at that time was absolutely fascinating.
Good. You know, in your introduction, it looks like you've had a tremendous amount of experience in the academics and the sciences. And then later in your career, you transitioned over to the product and technology side. Tell us a little bit about how that transition occurred.
So in academia, academia is interesting because it's a mix, obviously, of engineering, of technical skills, and also of very high aspirations about understanding things like consciousness and perception. And my personal route through academia was always focused on the sort of hands-on, experimental, technical part. So although, of course, everyone wants to understand if there's a seat of consciousness in the brain and where it might lie and how visual perception works, for example, these were very important things to me. But what drove me on a day-to-day basis was working in a lab with my hands, solving technical problems, buying equipment, putting it together, doing histology, doing surgeries, doing designing equipment for testing animals and doing electrophysiological recordings. And so after, I guess, 25 years of enjoying that process and being successful in terms of the currency of academia, which is basically getting grants and publishing papers, I found myself getting further and further away from that hands-on, practical problem-solving situation. And I, at a certain point, decided to make a big change and to get into an area where I would be able to be more focused on not on the sort of esoteric ideas of academia, but more on the craft of science rather than the actual practice of it. And so at that time, again, fortunately, Neuralink was, this was about 4.5 years ago. So Neuralink was just coming out of stealth. They had this, I don't know if anyone's seen this, but there's a video of the first presentations of some of the early Neuralink work at the Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. So I saw that. And also a former colleague of mine is one of the founders, a guy called Flip Sabies, who's since left the company. At that point, I realized, well, it's possible to get out of academia. For a long time, I'd thought I was basically a very highly trained monkey neurophysiologist and an anatomist. And there aren't too many jobs in an industry for monkey neurophysiologists, except Neuralink. When it came up, they were working on monkeys. They were doing electrophysiology. And so I thought, well, this is my first opportunity to actually get out of academia. With hindsight, I probably could have transferred out of academia sooner, but I think it's typical that people don't always consider the opportunities outside their day-to-day. And at a certain point, I just put in an application to Neuralink, and I remember Flip called me and said, "Are you serious?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm done with academia. I wouldn't say I was bored with it, but I'm not getting as much reward from it anymore." And so that was the transition. And to be honest, my only regret is that I didn't do it sooner. I think that's not to say anything against academia. Academia is essential, and scientific research is essential and has made everything we do at Neuralink possible. But it's very different to what we're doing at Neuralink. We're not doing science at Neuralink. We're an engineering company developing a medical device. And so, I mentioned the currency of academia is getting grants and getting papers. The currency in industry is, does your device work? And you don't need reviewer number 2 to tell you that. You don't need, to write begging letters to the NIH to get money. Well, luckily we don't have to do that. But at the end of the day, if your experiment or your device works and does what it's supposed to do, then you go with that. And then that's a very straightforward and simple kind of way of judging a career, instead of how many papers have you had, how many students have you had, how many citations do you have. So,
well, thanks, Dan. The one thing I think we're all curious about is, specifically, if you look at your day-to-day at Neuralink, with your background in neuroscience, visual systems, can you help us understand a little bit about how a visual system works and how you're overlaying the Neuralink technology to match that?
Right. So the primary application of the Neuralink brain implant, I'm guessing many of you have heard of a subject that a participant in an FDA trial that we is the first recipient of the Neuralink. So the application there is for someone who has tetraplegia, completely paralyzed from the neck down, and the Neuralink records information from their motor cortex of their brain, the part of the brain that controls or would have formerly controlled their hand if they didn't have a spinal cord injury. And instead of that information traveling down the spinal cord to control the muscles of the hand, it's recorded by the device and then decoded by an algorithm that converts it into basically an XY coordinate system for controlling a mouse on a computer. So X, Y, and click, and maybe left click and right click and scroll button. But basically, it's essentially a Bluetooth mouse inside your head. So a person with a Neuralink can walk up to a computer and pair with it, just like you would pair a Bluetooth mouse, and then control it just by thinking about moving their hand. And you can see we recently released some video of a participant playing chess and playing Civilization and really enjoying this newfound freedom that is allowed by the Neuralink. That's the first application. And the reason we chose that application is because it really only involves recording signals from the brain. And it's one of the only applications that really only needs to record and doesn't need to stimulate. So for other applications, particularly the one that I'm working on, which is a visual prosthesis, we need to actually input information into the brain. So the idea of the visual prosthesis is that instead of putting electrodes into the motor cortex, they go into the visual cortex, which is at the back of the brain. And the visual cortex contains a map of of what you see is retinotopically organized. So neighboring points in space fall onto neighboring points in your retina, and they're represented as neighboring points on your visual cortex. So your visual cortex is about the size of a credit card, and it contains half of your visual field, laid out just like a screen inside your brain. And the information in that screen is encoded in the activity of neurons. So in someone who's blind, all that machinery is still there. The only problem is that it's no longer getting an input from the eye. So someone with a degenerative retinal disease or an eye injury or an injury to the optic nerve is blind because obviously everything in front of the optic nerve doesn't work. But the visual cortex still works. So you can put electrodes into it and instead of recording, you can record as well, but instead of recording, you can actually stimulate pass current into the brain to produce activity within the visual cortex, and that results in visual perception. And for every electrode that you plug into the visual cortex, you can stimulate to produce a single sort of spot in the visual field. And because the visual cortex is organized retinotopically, these spots occur in different locations across the visual field. So the application for the Neuralink in vision is to obviously drill a hole, not here, but here, insert the electrodes into the visual cortex, and instead of recording, stimulate, and the pattern of stimulation is then controlled with a video camera. And probably the first thing that we would do would, for example, say, take the video camera on your iPhone and transmit the signal over Bluetooth to the device and change and control the pattern of stimulation on the device from the camera on your iPhone. So if you're blind, you would basically be able to hold your eye, which would be the video camera, look around, look behind you, and receive information from that video camera. That's not to say that we're expecting to be able to reproduce the incredibly deep and complex and vivid image that all of us have in front of our eyes all the time. We're basically working with spots of light rather than, the incredibly, to me, as a visual neuroscientist, is constantly amazing picture that we all have in front of our face. But what we will do is to be able to, by increasing the number of spots that we can see, these are called phosphenes, and the density, we'll be able to basically exploit the visual cortex as a sensory surface that we can use to input useful information to a blind person. So this would include information required to navigate their environment, to see objects, to recognize things. Yeah.
So if somebody that's blind is using the elements you just mentioned, what are they actually seeing? Is it like a dot printer type of look, or is it a Mario Brothers kind of look?
Yeah.
What do they see? It's not real color, right?
It's complicated, and I also want to make it clear that people have been stimulating visual cortex since the 1960s to produce spots of light called phosphenes, and all we're doing is basically increasing the number and increasing the field of view. And what people see it's something like a dot matrix printer, except that the spots of light aren't going to be regularly organized. Their location really just depends on exactly where the electrodes go. And we're basically pushing the electrodes in almost blindly through the cortex. And so you'll see a number of spots. If we just wired up those spots to, say, brightness from a video camera, you'd produce a very confusing image. So a lot of how this is going to work in humans is to do with the image analysis steps. So the camera, the image from the camera will be analyzed, and important features will be extracted, and only electrodes that convey those important parts of the image will be stimulated. So we'll basically be able to produce a very rarefied image in terms of little spots of light, but that image will actually be a useful image, and so you won't have to extract all the useful information from that image, which is what we do to normal vision all the time. And so
So now I'm going to ask you to get up, if you wouldn't mind, and share a slide.
Sure.
Of the N1 chip.
So let me just start with a kind of overview of what Neuralink is. We're trying to be vertically integrated. So we try and do everything ourselves. That includes designing ASICs or specialized chips that are on the device itself. We make our own electrodes. These are made by thin film deposition onto silicon wafers. We do all that in-house as well. And then because these electrodes are incredibly fine and thin, they have to be inserted by a surgical robot. So we've also developed and built a surgical robot. So the device itself slide. There we are. This is basically the device itself. I think, yeah, I even brought one here. So this is a Neuralink device, and I'll leave it here if anyone wants to come and look at it. But basically, it's a tiny circuit board with a number of amplifiers and some electronics on these ASICs, and it's connected to the electrodes, which electrodes on this one have been torn off because they're very fragile and thin. But the electrodes come out of the base, and so essentially what we do in the surgery is drill a hole in the skull that's the same size as this round part of the device. And then the robot inserts all of the electrodes into the cortex, and then the device itself plugs the hole, and then the whole thing is completely covered with the scalp. So there's no percutaneous connectors or wires or anything that the device communicates completely with Bluetooth. But really the breakthrough in this device is that the threads are so fine and so flexible that they move with the brain. So people are aware that if you move your head around, your brain is like a jelly sort of floating inside liquid inside your skull. And it moves quite substantially when you move your head. And so many previous approaches had used stiff wire electrodes. So we have developed these very fine electrodes that can move with the brain. And so they don't damage the brain, and they don't get surrounded by scar tissue and things that can prevent the signal. So just to give you an idea of these threads, this is just some threads that are slanted. You can see each thread actually has 16 electrodes on. So there's little tabs flowing past. Those are the electrodes. And a trace for each electrode. And at the very tip of the thread, there's a little loop, and that's the loop that the robot needle picks up and transports the thread over, insert it into the brain. From this image, you really can't get an idea about how small these are. So I made a fun movie. Here you can see a normal ant that I just found on the sidewalk, and here are the loops. You can just see the row of loops on each of the threads, and so you see the loop on the end. And that little black spot is the first electrode of 16 on each one. So it's the robot needle goes through the little hole in the end, peels off the thread, and it inserts into the brain.
How do you get this technology to move a prosthetic? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here, because you've talked about some of the applications, but some of them to be able to, take somebody that's disadvantaged and move the prosthetics around is so important.
So once you've decoded the signals to produce a mouse movement on the screen, converting that into a three-dimensional trajectory to control a robot arm, for example, is reasonably trivial, and it's technology. It's not science at that stage. One of the projects that we're working at now is actually we're collaborating with the Tesla Optimus robot, so that we'll be able to control, basically take the arm or maybe even the entire Optimus robot and control it with the output from the device. So as the person thinks about moving, then it's just a matter of decoding the neural activity that's associated with those intended movements and converting it into signals that can control the servos and motors in the prosthetic limb.
So conceptually, overcoming blindness is a potential path. Prosthetics, potential path for this. Mental illness, potential path. Depression. These are all things, depending on where you move the chip, the N1 chip, into different parts of the brain, you could solve these problems down the road.
Yes,
and with enough funding, of course.
So we're concentrating on the low-hanging fruit first, and things that have also been done before. So again, we're not claiming to be the first people to do any of this. There's been a very successful field of brain-computer interface research going back 20 years, where people have been able to, in humans, control cursors exactly as we are, with fewer electrodes and also with percutaneous connectors. What we're really concentrating on is taking this technology out of the lab and making it into something that people can use at home without having racks of computers and a team of postdocs around them all the time. And so other applications are vision, as we've mentioned. There's also a possibility in epilepsy. So people with focal epilepsy have a little dysplasia, often in the cortex, that can even be seen just under normal MRI sometimes. And so the idea here would be that we insert the electrodes into that area, and at the very least, we provide an early warning system for that person. So it's a Bluetooth device. You can easily imagine your Apple Watch gives an alert when the device detects epileptiform activity and says, you better sit down or lie down, you're going to have a seizure, or it automatically calls someone, a loved one, to tell them and let them know what's happening. This is an application very close to my heart because my 22-year-old daughter is exactly that subject. She has a little dysplasia in her left cortex, and that would have helped her a number of times. Even just a few seconds of warning could have been extremely useful. But beyond that, the idea would be to actually do something about that activity. So we could have thousands of electrodes in that area, and as well as recording activity, we could stimulate. And there are obviously scientific research on this project, but if we could stimulate regions of the cortex surrounding that area, or perhaps in other parts of the brain, to try and prevent that epileptiform activity becoming a seizure, that would be life-changing for many people. Other applications are, there's a big problem for many people called tinnitus. And one thing I've noticed, I never knew that much about it, but one thing I've noticed is whenever we tweet something or put something on the internet about something that we're doing at Neuralink, there's always a bunch of comments saying, when are you going to be able to cure tinnitus? Tinnitus is an incredibly debilitating disease for many people. There are even people who have committed suicide because they have intractable tinnitus. So another application would be, and so the idea of tinnitus is that you have basically overactivity of your auditory system, and it often occurs within a frequency range that is basically the resonant frequency of your cochlea. So when you hear broadband noise, there's a resonant frequency, it's about 22 kilohertz, I think, that wipes out a region of your cochlea so that your brain doesn't get any input from that frequency. And the brain is I'm anthropomorphizing about the brain here, like a real neuroscientist. But the brain thinks, well, where's this activity gone? It must be super quiet, so I'll just turn up the gain. And so the brain keeps turning up the gain, expecting to receive a signal in this frequency range, but it never occurs. In turning up the gain, it basically produces a feedback system that produces this high-pitched whining for many people. If we could, this again is, the way to do this would be to initially develop a device that would stimulate that auditory cortex. Again, auditory cortex is kind of tonotopic, so there's a region that is specialized for that particular frequency. If we could stimulate it, the brain would think, oh, okay, here's the input, I can turn the gain down. But beyond that, perhaps this would also be a way to restore hearing to people who are deaf. And obviously, there's current technology for that is the cochlear implant. But the cochlear implant is basically a way to understand language. It doesn't restore hearing in the way that we experience hearing. Perhaps by being able to insert thousands of electrodes into auditory cortex and stimulating them according to the output from the microphone, we might be able to restore more natural sounding hearing to deaf people. That's another application.
Yeah. So when you look at all these applications, you think there's going to need to be a tremendous amount of engineering inside Neuralink to cope with next great things that you're telling us about. Mm. Can you give us an idea, without telling us anything proprietary, just give us an idea of what kind of people you have inside the company working with you, and a little bit about the culture of a startup, which would be.
So I don't have that much experience with startups. Neuralink was the first job I took outside of academia, and I'm not sure. I suspect that much of what happens at Neuralink is not typical for a startup. But one thing that I think is exciting for me, and that I didn't really expect, is that there's a huge amount of autonomy at Neuralink. So there's this idea that the ideal employee is someone who walks in the door, looks around, can see what needs to happen, sees what needs to be done, and then goes ahead and does it. Sometimes we get people like that who are just phenomenal. They walk in, they hardly need any supervision. No one has time to manage someone or micromanage anyone. And sometimes people walk in and they look around and they kind of look lost and say, well, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. No one's told me what I'm supposed to be doing. And to them, it's like, well, we're making a brain-computer interface here. So if you're the kind of person who can just basically see something and then actually do it rather than coming up with reasons why it can't be done, then you're incredibly valuable. So there's a great many people like that. There used to be, that culture has changed a little bit as the company has expanded. When I joined, we were 50 people. We were based in the Mission District in San Francisco. We shared an office building with OpenAI, interestingly. We had no idea what they were doing. And they didn't know what we were doing either. That as the company's expanded, obviously roles have become more specialized, and the role of a generalist, which was really my kind of role when I joined, has become less important. But 90% or maybe even 99% of people at Neuralink are engineers. We can count the number of neuroscientists like myself on really, well, just over one hand. So, and those engineers are every aspect of engineering, from thin film lithography through ASIC design, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, robotics engineers, a lot of software development, and a lot of people who just are very good at everything. So that's the sort of, and very few. Turns out neuroscientists publish everything they do, and so you don't really need them. You can just read their papers. They're good for the lunchtime conversation. I think that's probably my major role at Neuralink, is talking about the brain. But yeah, so you don't need to be a neuroscientist or a neurosurgeon or anything like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Now, everybody knows about Elon Musk being one of the founders of this company. Tell us what it's like to work with him a little bit. And I know you've had interaction with him. What's that like? And you're still alive, so I'm assuming it's not that bad.
I personally have never failed to be impressed by Elon. I'm not quite sure how he does it, but he comes into a meeting. Actually, this is a little less true since the whole Twitter thing. But at the beginning of the company, we would have weekly meetings, and he would just know exactly what everyone was doing. And he would get up to date incredibly quickly and actually have useful and important suggestions about things to do. And he has, I like to describe him as the world's biggest bullshit detector. He can come in, look at projects, hear about something that you're doing, and instantly know whether it's necessary, whether it's important, and how much effort should be expended on that particular project. Scientists need to be herded a little bit, like cats, I guess, not a very good analogy, but they need to be guided, because the instinct of a scientist, and also of many engineers, is to find a rabbit hole and then dive down it and dig and dig and dig. And because they know at the bottom of that rabbit hole, there might be a little piece of knowledge that hasn't been learned by the world yet. And that's a good property of a scientist, but a very bad property of someone who's trying to actually get something developed and built, like a real device built that works. Because obviously you can go down those rabbit holes as much as you want and you make very little progress. The important thing is to know when to stop digging and when to move on. And so for me, going into industry, this is great because I'm not very patient, and personally, if I see something's not working or is not very relevant, I'm inclined to give up on it. But of course, in science, you don't do that. You keep digging, even if it comes out as a negative experiment. It's your responsibility as a scientist to uncover this natural truth that is hidden from you. But if you in industry, if you do that, you're going to be dead. And so the input from Elon is, he has a bunch of sayings which everyone is very familiar with. I think the most important one is the best part is no part. So, and his biggest gripe about engineers is that they spend 90% of their time engineering devices that should not exist. So the best way to solve a problem is to delete the part. And if it so happens that you need to put that everything goes wrong and you have to put that part back, then that's a good thing. It means that the part was actually really valuable. And so we should be putting things back like 10% of the time that we delete them. And so, and having that, it's very easy as a working, levels down deeply in a particular subject. It's very easy to lose sight of what is really necessary and what is just satisfying your curiosity as a scientist or as an engineer.
How is the FDA regulatory agency involved with you in this industry? And what part do they play? And how do you get through them to do what you need to do?
So, yeah, obviously every medical device needs to be approved by the FDA. And our device is known as a class 3 medical device, which is a device that is implanted and invasive. So to get that authorization, we have to go through a number of steps with the FDA. The first step was to have authorization for experimental investigative exemption, IDE. So IDE, anyway. And this basically allows us to test our device for safety in humans. And to do that, we have to provide a huge amount of evidence that the device is going to be safe. And we're in that stage at the moment. So our device is not FDA approved for use, but we do have permission or an exemption to be able to implant it into humans and to study them and to see what kind of benefit we can provide. This is mostly a safety testing stage, and there's no guarantee to those subjects that they're going to get any benefit from the device whatsoever. Obviously, we want them to have a benefit from the device, and so far that looks like that we are able to provide some benefit to the subjects.
How long does it take to get through the FDA?
So we approached the FDA, I think 2 years ago, and went through an initial communication with them. And, the FDA are very strict, and we were a company coming up with something that had never been done before, using a robot to insert these electrodes into the brain. And so it took us a long time to get their trust and for them to trust us. And so we've been working with them for, I think, about 2 years so far. And I can't predict how long it's going to take to get to the next stage of development of the device, but the next stage will be a set of tests again in humans that show that the device is not only safe but is also effective. And by the end of that point, we can begin to get market approval. So for the device, and I can't predict how long that would be, but we're hoping obviously as soon as possible.
So we've talked a little bit about Neuralink. How about the competition out there? Is it stiff? Can you tell us publicly what they're doing different than what you're doing and how you're better?
So there are a number of neurotech companies. Some of them have taken a different route to us, and it's not necessarily an inferior route, but in some ways it's led to easier approval from the FDA. So one company have developed a device that is inserted through the veins, and it's called a stent rod, which is basically a stent electrode that goes up into the superior sagittal sinus, which is a big blood-containing sinus in between the two hemispheres. And it goes in there and expands slightly and is able to remotely record neural activity from the motor cortex. And because putting stents into the vasculature is something that is basically already proved and used in medicine, they've had a much shorter path to getting FDA approval because they're basically piggybacking on to something that's already approved. And they've had success with developing a brain-computer interface with this device. The limitations of it are that it has many fewer electrodes. Our device at the moment has 1,024. I'm not actually sure how many are on the stent rod, but it's in the order of less than 100. And also those electrodes are receiving information that is much more remote from, they're not recording the individual activity of neurons. They're recording basically a mass activity of all the neurons called the LFP. And so what they've been able to do is use basically a click signal, so they can have people, instead of having like XY control of a mouse, they can determine whether the person clicks or not. For us, that's not enough, and we think that a more invasive approach is in the long run going to be more helpful. And there are other companies developing different kinds of electrodes. Again, most of them are less invasive than our approach. So our ideas are that we're interested in getting the highest resolution signal from the brain, and we can overcome the invasiveness by making the technology to insert those electrodes very sophisticated and using very fine and flexible electrodes. So we're probably the most invasive company, but we have the most potential to recover the highest fidelity signals and also to have a greater number of applications than other companies.
Thank you, Dan. You know, a lot of us have experienced watching a startup, but participating is a whole different ballgame. And I've been in a few myself, and I know how stressful. So I'm going to take it down a little bit to you. When you look at the kind of pressure and stress that goes on in a startup, how do you, being a father of two wonderful girls, how do you balance yourself through that? What kinds of things do you do outside the company to remain sane without needing a chip?
I think I'm in kind of a privileged position. My life has taken a path that is actually quite beneficial in terms of this stage in my career. So I have two wonderful daughters who are both at college. One at UC Berkeley studying mechanical engineering. I'm very proud of her. And the other one on the East Coast. So they're both left home. I divorced my wife and I'm living alone, quite close to work, and I'm able to immerse myself in my work as much as I want to. There obviously is some pressure to get things done at Neuralink. We like to move fast, and we like to create short deadlines and inspire people to work. But everyone at Neuralink is doing their life's work. They are completely invested and excited and feel privileged to be able to work in that environment. There is stress, but I think personally, I'm kind of immune to stress. maybe not, but no, I go cycling. I try and enjoy my daughters when they're home, but for me, this is a new phase in my career. Basically, my career has sort of reached a plateau in academia, And now it's just accelerating again in this new endeavor. It's super exciting.
Let's give Dan a round of applause, please. I mean, he's been very good to hear. We'd like to open it up to questions from you, Nada. Oh, sweet.
I was just wondering, I know you are more on the neuroscience side of things, but do you have any familiarity with like what machine learning and AI things are being used currently and what you're doing or just Neuralink in general?
So we do use some machine learning algorithms in decoding the signal from motor cortex. We're planning to, so one of the problems, but these are very sort of primitive machine learning applications. There's not really an application for AI in the company, aside from people using it to write code. Myself, who've never learned how to write code, suddenly oh, wait a minute, I can just ask ChatGPT and it writes code for me, which is phenomenal. There's an application for machine learning in my part of the implant. One of the problems with the visual implant is that you put all these electrodes into someone who's blind and you stimulate them, but you don't know where those phosphenes are in their visual field. So the way that this has been done until now is to have the blind person basically point to where all these points are. But which is fine if you only got 64 or 100 electrodes, but we're planning to put 6,000 in our first patient. So obviously you don't want to go through each of those individually. So there'll be applications for producing patterns that the person identifies as figures or letters, and then some sort of machine learning way to basically calibrate the visual system for those subjects. That could be one potential application. But in general, you know, one of the premises of Neuralink, one of the sort of founding principles was that it will allow us to communicate with or become symbiotic with artificial intelligence. So far, we're not doing that. And if you ask me, I think that's quite a ways off, by which I mean a few hundred years. But, you know, I've been wrong before. So we'll see. But no, there's not a huge emphasis on artificial intelligence. You know, what we're doing at the moment is fairly mechanistic. We have a very simple, very fast algorithm. Everything has to work super low latency for decoding signals from the brain if you want to have any kind of control over a cursor. And so this is a very straightforward, simple algorithm that decodes signals. So, you know, we do have machine learning specialists, but it's not a huge focus for the company.
Hi. So I know you mentioned that 90% of the company is engineers. If someone doesn't have a formal background in any of the biology stuff, what would you recommend that they look into or learn to contribute to technology like this?
So there are specialized roles. So yeah, Raj mentioned that we're hiring good people as fast as we can, which doesn't mean that we're hiring fast. So the kinds of roles we're looking for are people who have a proven track record of actually getting things done, solving problems and producing things that work from beginning to end. We're not looking for ideas people. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have ideas, but it means that you need to have more than ideas. You need to actually have those ideas, produce them, and get them working from start to finish. There's a sort of argument at Neuralink about people with PhDs. So obviously everyone thinks if you have a PhD, then you must be qualified to do something. We don't necessarily feel that's true. The good thing about a PhD is not that you have a PhD, is that you've been in an environment, laboratory environment, where you have technology and scientific toys and modes of analysis and everything at your disposal, and you can use all those things to produce, to get something to work, which is basically your PhD thesis, to do research. And that is a good thing. That's a good track record for an employee, because it means that they can, you know, literally do things. They're not. You know, if it was a philosophy PhD, maybe it would be different. But For the most part, in the biological sciences and engineering, that the environment that you're in to do a PhD is a very good training environment to get a job at Neuralink, for example. But that doesn't mean that you have to have a PhD to work there. It just means that you've been in that environment that has generated the kinds of skills that you need. But you know, there are jobs for basically almost every field of engineering at Neuralink, from electrochemistry through, you know, as I said, ASIC design, thin layer, mechanical, robotics. And so that as a background, and then on top of that, some evidence that you're actually going to be a useful person and not wander around saying that you don't know what you're supposed to be doing.
Thank you for the great talk. I had a question at the start of the talk. It was your extensive experience in academia was mentioned, and I was kind of wondering what the consistent factor of motivation was for you from jumping from the PhD to a postdoc to multiple other positions. So what kind of kept you going so that you could get to the point you are?
So to begin with, I was basically following a path of least resistance. I went to university because I needed something to study, and I was interested in the brain, and neuroscience popped up, and that was very fortunate. And I studied neuroscience and found myself, one of my lecturers during my neuroscience degree is a professor, a guy called Professor Semir Zeki, who is one of the seminal discoverers of the way that information is processed in the visual cortex. And so after his lecture, I went up and said, hey, I'm really interested in visual processing. And he said, oh, well, why don't you come to my lab to do a PhD? Okay. So that happened. And he was also at UCL. And so I survived 4 years with him and ended up with a PhD, at which point, well, what comes next? Postdoc. So I looked around and I saw an advert for a postdoc at San Francisco, at UCSF. And I was like, well, I've never been to the States before. It'd be nice to spend 3 years doing a postdoc in San Francisco. And so I turned up at SFO with a suitcase, having never even spoken to my postdoc supervisor. We just did everything on email. I sent him a copy of my PhD thesis, and he said, okay, come over and see how it goes. So I spent, but what I didn't realize is that the lab that I was supposed to be doing the research in for that project in ophthalmology at UCSF, I was working with a guy called Jonathan Horton in ophthalmology. The lab hadn't actually been built. So one of the first jobs I had was to talk to architects about designing a monkey vivarium for doing recordings in awake behaving monkeys, recording from the visual system. So we got the lab built, and then he said, well, you can't be a postdoc anymore. Now you have to be a staff scientist. So I was like, okay, whatever. And then a few years later, it's like, well, now you can't be a staff scientist anymore. So we have to put you on the faculty. So you got an adjunct professorship there. But all the time I was really just following what I was interested in, doing what I loved, which was working in a lab, doing surgeries, doing histology, cutting brains, doing electrophysiological recording, building eye trackers. And it was a very small lab, so I could do all of those things. And eventually, the lab was built. We did the experiments and a whole bunch more. And it was, you know, I was 25 years into a 3-year postdoc. And along the way, I got married and had kids. And at that point, was like, well, now I'm ready for something new. And that was the inspiration to say, okay, I've worked with Jonathan for long enough, and then to go into industry. And my first industry application was to Apple. So Apple advertised it must have been 5 years ago. They advertised for a neuroscientist. I was like, well, I'm a neuroscientist. I want to work at Apple. And after like 6 months of backwards and forwards, turned out that they weren't really looking for a neuroscientist. They were looking for someone who could write code. And so that wasn't me. But at that point, I was like, Neuralink popped up. So I just turned around the application and said, okay, well, I'll go for that.
So I have a question about the so you were trained as a traditional neuroscientist, is that correct?
Yes.
And so when you kind of ended up at Neuralink, I understand Neuralink uses the dynamical systems approach to processing and extracting signals from the brain. how did you find your transition from like classical neuroscience, your E-fuse recording, spike sorting and whatnot, onto using that dynamical systems approach?
I'm not sure what you mean by dynamical systems approach.
I'm talking about the methods pioneered by Krishna Shenoy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my background, and the reason I don't know what that means is because my background was not in that area of neuroscience. So I had been studying binocular vision and stereopsis and how that goes wrong in people with strabismus, kids who grow up with misaligned eyes. And I'd heard Krishna speak, and we also collaborated with him in the early days since his tragic passing away. But I had very little background in that area. But it turns out that the basic principles are very similar. So, as you mentioned, things like spike sorting. We're able to stream full resolution images from electrodes as well as sort of a more compressed version of neural activity off the device. So it's very similar to just the kinds of recordings that I was used to making in monkeys for the last 25 years and working in the visual system. So as I say, I never had very much input into the decoding algorithm. I was very much in the early days, I was doing, I like to think I'm very egalitarian. I was building monkey rigs, and during the pandemic, I was literally building the labs that we have in Fremont now. So I was very happy putting up shelves and fitting out operating rooms and building monkey rigs, building eye trackers, as well as every other part of the sort of academic side of it. So the transition, I think, wasn't really that tough because I never changed what I was doing, which was basically part builder, part electrophysiologist, part anatomist, and I just did things that I was good at. And thankfully, those were the things that were needed at the time. We also got into pigs, and there's a whole different story, but I also got into like building pigsties and like going to tractor supply company to buy fences and welding them up and I'll do anything basically.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Dan.
Hey.
So what sort of transformations does it take to encode image features into the visual cortex space? Like, I'm curious if you can speak on the language of neurons. I assume they don't take RGB and intensity. So do they like frequency, amplitude, some sort of funky serial?
That's precisely what we're investigating at the moment, and much of this work has already been done. But basically, when we stimulate the neurons, we're not able to choose what kind of percept we produce. What the person sees when we stimulate a certain population of neurons that just happen to be around that electrode, what the person sees is dependent on what those neurons do. So the visual system works like on a labeled line system. So you have a bunch of neurons that signal red. They only respond when something red crosses their receptive field. So if you stimulate those neurons, then you're going to see red. You can't change their selectivity. So the kind of parameters that we're changing are related to ways that we can change the salience of that particular point. So far, we don't have electrodes in visual cortex of humans, but we do have it in some monkeys. So what we can do, it's very difficult to get a monkey to describe to you what they're perceiving, but what you can do is stimulate a flash, and you can know whether they saw it or not because they're trained to look at it. So they're looking at a point in the middle of the screen. To begin with, you actually put real flashes on the screen, and they get a reward with an eye tracker. You can tell when they look at the flash. You can give them a reward. But then you start intermingling those actual flashes on the screen with stimulating different electrodes, and they look towards the region of their visual field that they see the phosphine. So the percentage of the time is, or they look at that particular point, gives you a psychometric measure of how salient that point is. We don't know precisely what they're seeing. That's really the next stage that we may do. The other easier way is just to put this into human and say, what do you see? So you could spend months trying to figure out what a monkey sees by trying all kinds of forced choice match to sample tests in a human, you get it in seconds. So that may be a waste of time, and much better to just get everything proved for insertion into humans and then go directly to humans. So yeah, the kinds of things that we're changing are frequency. So we have little square wave pulses that are sort of charge balanced, so we don't have any electrochemical imbalances. We can change frequency, we can change pulse width, change amplitude. Those are the main things that we're playing with to plot psychometric curves in these monkeys. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Ask questions. I guess a lot of my questions come from the difference between private versus public research. And, there's one obvious question, which is, on the pragmatics, what's the difference in, like, for example, the timeline? Because, there's always a runway, right? Whether it's a grant or a funder, so like, basically, what's the difference? What's the timeline that you're working on? What are your goals that you set? And then the other question that comes from that is basically like, here's a good example. I think we have all these small labs that are all working on analysis of electrophysiology data. And since none of us have the funding, we all kind of work together. And so we're so excited when KiloSort 4 comes out and there's the latest spike sorting software. Do you guys have the funding where you develop all of that in-house, or are you still very dependent on the academic community for your research and analysis?
So I think we don't do as much research as most people think. We're not focused on research for research's sake. So everything that we do has to have a direct application. We're not, most of the research, and this has really been done already. People have been working with motor control BCIs for 20 years, and the science has been done. We're developing the technology. Obviously, we're trying to refine the way that we use the science that's been developed and trying different things, but we're not developing anything new. And that's true for the motor BCI as well as for the visual system. The objective of the company is to produce a medical device that can help people. It's not yet, at least, to discover anything about the brain. Now, we're developing a tool which is actually going to be incredibly useful to scientists to discover new things about the brain, but that's not our focus. We're hoping, I personally am hoping at least, that we'll be able to give back this device to the scientific community and say, look, here's a device where you can record 6,000 neurons in a freely behaving monkey, which most neurophysiologists are just going to, wet themselves over. So,
scientists yet?
Yes, we have not. Well, we've collaborated with some scientists from Stanford and also from UCL. I had a poster at Society for Neuroscience on a collaboration. There are difficulties with putting this into the hands of scientists that are more difficult than, for example, the Utah array. So the sort of, if anyone's not familiar with this, there's another brain interface that is pictured there, which is basically like a device that puts electrodes into the brain. And this has been used so far for many brain-computer interface projects. And it's also sold to scientists to use. We can't really sell our device. We'd like to, but the problem is that it comes with the robot implantation. And we're also not a service industry. We don't want to get calls from scientists saying, oh, my monkey's device stopped working. Can you send someone out to fix it? And so we don't have the infrastructure in place to support the use of our device in academia. That doesn't mean that we don't want to be able to do that. And there are a number of models that we've looked at. One of them might be, for example, we throw a robot in a truck, drive up to a university, put it in the parking lot and say, okay, bring out your animals. We'll implant them for you, and then we'll go again. Because the robot is a substantial piece of equipment. Another one might be that we can somehow give or sell animals that are pre-implanted. But there's a lot of issues around that make it very difficult to do with the way that animal research is organized in universities by IACACs and by the USDA and by licenses that you need to sell animals and even things like, we don't want to be foiled by companies. And if we deal with, so for example, all our medical records from UC Davis were obtained from the Freedom of Information Act, and you've probably seen horror stories in the press about that. So we don't want to do that again. So that makes everything difficult administratively and regulatory to do. That doesn't mean that we don't want to do that. Yeah.
Let's do one.
Thank you for coming and talking at UC Santa Cruz. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the surgical implantation process. So how much are humans involved? How much are robots involved? And then might be kind of a naive question, but how do you know precisely where to put these electrodes in the brain?
Yeah. So the surgery is, so the first thing we do is we have an fMRI image of the brain of the actual subject when they're trying to move their hand. Obviously, they're paralyzed, so it doesn't move, but we can find a part of the brain that lights up with fMRI. And we produce a trajectory with an intraoperative targeting system. We use one called BrainLab, which basically allows the surgeon to point a pointer at the surface of the patient's head and see on a screen an MRI or a CT at that level with a trajectory already placed. So with that, the surgeon basically can draw a circle on the skull, literally with a pencil, and drill a hole. We developed a little oscillating circular saw so we can cut a perfectly round hole. And then underneath the skull is the dura. The surgeon removes a circle of dura with a pair of scissors and exposes the brain. And if the targeting was correct, and we recognize that piece of brain from the MRI, and we can see where we need to put the electrodes. So far, that's all done by this human surgeon. At this point, the robot takes over. So the robot has a number of imaging modalities, very high magnification camera. And so that images the surface of the brain. And then on the robot controller's screen, we see that image and he can basically place targets. So for our first humans, we had 64 threads, each with 16 electrodes for our 1024 electrodes. And the operator literally just clicks on that image of the brain wherever we want to put a target. And those targets are determined from the surface vasculature. So there's blood vessels running all over the surface of the brain, so we avoid those, so we don't want to cause any bleeding. But we also know where about within that region we got the highest fMRI activity. So we try and place our electrodes in those regions. We also can change the depth that those electrodes are inserted. So in motor cortex, for example, the cortex is a layered structure. We want most of our electrodes to be in the motor cortex. We want to be those in layer 5 because it contains like the output neurons. Those are the ones closest to the muscle. So we record from those. They also happen to be big, so we get great signals. So we can change the depth according to how deep those are inserted to maximize the chances of getting those electrodes. But the placement is basically follows. So we open up a circle that's about 25 millimeters diameter. The placement is basically, I hate this expression, but it's like a carpet bomb, basically. We can change the density in some regions that we think are more likely to carry good signals, but we also don't want to ignore cortex that we've exposed. So we have a sort of dense region in one part and then a scattering of electrodes everywhere else. And as time goes on, we'll learn more about where the best places are to put these electrodes. But for the most part, motor cortex is not very precisely sort of spatiotopic. The neurons are mixed up pretty well in there. So, it's not one of the most critical decisions that we make.
There's one question which is online, which is, what is the next 10 to 15-year plan for you guys at Neuralink?
Yeah.
And what is up for the industry and how is it going to progress?
So the plan is to produce a device that can help thousands of people. We have a target to implant 22,000 people by 2030. So we're going to basically ramp up exponentially. And the only way to do that is to do things at scale. So we'll have Neuralink clinics that will each have 8 operating rooms, for example, a single neurosurgeon, and we'll have people coming in and going out in the same day to get their implants. And we'll be implanting thousands of people a week. That's the aim.
And just non-tech question from me. I don't understand science. I heard robot and Bluetooth. So I'm figuring out how do you charge the device in your hair.
The device is charged with a coil, just like your Sonicare toothbrush. You hold this coil against the head and it charges up in about an hour.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much for joining. Appreciate your time. Wonderful. Just for some housekeeping, we'll be back in about a month with other guest lecturers. I want to thank the Sikh Foundation, UCSC, Basket Engineering for helping us with all of this. And tell your friends, we'll be back. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.